Okay, today's Daf Yomi, my friends, is Yevamos Daf Vav, Yevamos 6. We're going to start on the bottom of Hey Amabeis. We're going to start on the bottom of 5b because the Gemara is trying to prove this concept of how do we know, because what happened was the Gemara cited, we know that the mitzvah of Yibum tells us that we're not allowed, that a brother has to marry his deceased brother's widow. However, the Gemara cites from the verse Aleha, which tells us you're not allowed to marry your wife's sister while your wife is alive. You're not allowed to marry your wife's sister. The Gemara tells us from that point that even if she falls to Yibum with you, you don't marry her. So there's a specific verse telling us that. So the Gemara tells us, yeah, but from the fact that there's a specific verse telling us not to marry, that she doesn't fall to Yibum, because otherwise you would have said she does fall to Yibum. Why? Why would you say that? Because it must be that a positive commandment of doing Yibum overrides the negative commandment of not marrying your wife's sister, even though that negative commandment is so severe of a kares penalty. So the Gemara wants to know, what's our source for this idea that an asay docha los asay sheyesh bo kares, that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment, even when there is a kares penalty, even such a severe one, because that's why we need the verse allowed to tell us that in this case it doesn't override it. So the Gemara says on the bottom of 5b, the Gemara says, so the reason why we need the word aleha, we're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 lines from the bottom, ela itzrach, the reason why we need the word aleha is because you would have thought a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment, even when it's so severe that there's kares, because you would have thought you could derive it from honoring your father and mother. There's a mitzvah to honor your father and mother. The Tanya, it says in the Brisa, I might have thought that honoring your father and mother overrides Shabbos. Now, no, your father and mother you shall fear, but guard my Shabbos. Both your father and mother and you have to guard my honor. Even if your parents let you violate Shabbos, you have to keep the Shabbos. So in that case, we don't say positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. In that case, because there's a verse, but generally speaking, we would say positive commandment overrides another commandment. And what type of negative commandment are we talking about there? My love, Chotli or Basheli, where your parents said, cook for me or slaughter for me. And the reason why you don't do it, the time of the Kasav Rachmana Shabsosei Tishmaro, it's because your parents, the reason why you don't listen is because the Torah has a specific verse saying don't to listen. Gar my Shabbos. Otherwise, you would say that listening to your parents would override the Shabbos. And that's a prohibition where you would get kares. If you intentionally violate the Shabbos without witnesses, you get kares. So don't we see from here that this is the source for the idea that the positive overrides a negative commandment, even when it's severe penalty of kares? We're on the top of 6a. The Gemara says, no. Lav de mechamer. No, that is not we're not talking about a prohibition where you violate Shabbos where you get kares. We're talking about the prohibition of mechamer, where you're leading an animal. That's what you're doing. You're leading an animal that is otherwise, and so that's not a prohibition of Shabbos. It's a prohibition of Shabbos, but just a regular prohibition, not one where you would get kares, where basically the animal is laden with goods on it, and so therefore you're causing it to carry, and you're not allowed to cause your animal to work on the Shabbos. So the Gemara says, so if that's the case, why? So in this case, we say it doesn't override the Shabbos. That the positive commandment to listen to your parents does not override the Shabbos. So why not? That which we learned throughout the rest of the Shas, that a positive commandment does not override a regular negative commandment. That a positive commandment does override a regular negative commandment. Why don't you derive from here that a positive commandment does not override a negative commandment? Just like over here, the positive commandment of listening to your parents does not override the regular prohibition of violating Shabbos. Also throughout the Talmud, we should never say a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. But in fact, we do say that. So the Gemara says, and if you want to say Shani Lave to Shabbos, if you want to say, well, the prohibitions of Shabbos, the reason why a positive commandment doesn't override them is the Chamire, is because they're so stringent. Because somebody who violates the Shabbos is compared to somebody who's not keeping the whole Torah. And so therefore, maybe that's the reason why a regular prohibition is not overridden. And so therefore, we can't learn from this to the rest of the Shas. That's not the case. But this Tana, but there we know that there's a Tana, that there's a source that cites a source in general with respect to other prohibitions, even now with respect to Shabbos, the low kaparach. And we don't ask that question. The Tanya, Yachol Amaro Av, if he tameh, let's say your father tells you if you're a Kohen, go become tameh. O Shamaro Al Tachsir, or if your father tells you not to return a lost object. Yachol Yishamalo, I might think you have to listen to your father and not violate the Torah. Tamomer Ish Imo Vaviv Tiro Veshab Sosai Tishmaro. It says, your father or mother you shall fear and guard my Shabbos. Kulchem Chayavim Bechfodi. All of you are obligated in my honor. So we see from here that this idea that you don't listen to your parents when they tell you to violate the Torah doesn't just apply to Shabbos, it applies to all these other laws. And yet we have a specific verse telling us that. Otherwise, we would have thought that you would have to listen to them. So why wouldn't we say, Asay dochelos asay, a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment? So the Gemara says, no, the problem with this source is Mishum de'iko mifrach ma'alahanach shakein hechsher mitzvah. This is not a good source because you could break the kal v'chomer, you could break the argument by saying these cases are different because there's a hechsher mitzvah. Now, normally a hechsher mitzvah means something else in the Shas. Normally a hechsher mitzvah means something that you're doing to prepare the mitzvah. But the way Rashi explains our Gemara, it's very controversial, Rashi's approach, but we'll just stick with Rashi's approach, is he's saying this mitzvah is fundamentally different because in this case, the only way you could do this mitzvah is by violating the prohibition. Whereas opposed to Yibum, if you don't do Yibum, you still have another option, which is Chalitza. And so therefore, you can't learn from this source to Yibum and Chalitza. And so we still don't have a source for the idea that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment by a prohibition of kares. And so why do we know that? Why do we need a verse to teach us that you don't marry your wife's sister in this case? We would have, because with Aleha, why again? What are we searching for? That the Torah, the Gemara has told us that even though there's a mitzvah of Yibum, in general, you don't apply this Yibum to your wife's sister because of the word Aleha. So if they hadn't given us that verse of the word Aleha, we would have said a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment, even when it's a prohibition of kares. And Gemara, so what's our source for that idea that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment? And we still don't have a source for that idea by a prohibition of kares. So the Gemara says, so Ella Sakadai Tachamina, this Rashi is controversial. Other people take a different approach to this Rashi because they're saying there's a mitzvah of Yibum. There's a mitzvah of Yibum. And so by doing Chalitza, you're still not doing the mitzvah of Yibum. So Rashi is saying, yeah, there's another way to do the mitzvah, but that's not really accurate because you're not really doing the mitzvah here. Anyway, that's the controversy. So the Gemara says, Ella, Sakadai Tachamina. So rather, there's another approach. If you wouldn't have had this word of Allah telling us not to do it, you might have thought that you have to marry that. You would have known that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. We learned it out. Binyan Beis HaMikdash, from the obligation to build a temple. You have to build a Beis HaMikdash. The Tanya Yochel Binyan Beis HaMikdash Toch Shabbos, but you might have thought you could build a temple on Shabbos. It says, guard my Shabbos and fear my Mikdash. Kulchem Chayavim Bechvodi. That you don't build my Mikdash on Shabbos. My love, aren't we talking about the bone of Esos? Aren't we talking about building and destroying, which are violations of Shabbos, which are kares? And so therefore, we're saying that this is the source of the idea that generally speaking, we're not for this case. A positive commandment overrides a negative commandment, even by the penalty of kares. The time of the custom Rahmana Tishmaro. What's the reason why we don't build a temple on Shabbos? Because it says specifically, you shall guard my Shabbos. But we're not for this specific commandment. We would say dachi. We would say it does override the Shabbos. So this would be the source of the idea: positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. Gemara says no, but even by mitzvah of kares. Gemara says no, lav de mechamer. It's not a commandment, a prohibition where you get kares. This is a commandment where it's just a general prohibition of mechamer, a regular prohibition. So the Gemara asks the same question we asked earlier about filu hachi lo dachi. So then why doesn't it override the vafilu hachi lo dachi? So it doesn't. Then in general, the positive commandment would not have overridden in here. That which we hold throughout the rest of the Talmud, that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. Why don't we use this as the source that it doesn't override it? Why don't we use this as the source that it doesn't override the negative commandment? Explains the Gemara. Gemara says, and if you want to say Shani Lavi the Shabbos Techamir, the same discussion we said before, I'm going to say when the prohibitions of Shabbos are different because they're stricter. But there's a source that cites this as a ruling in general. And we don't say that. Let's say, for example, the father says to you, violate the Shabbos by become tamei, or the father says to you, don't return a lost object. I think you have to listen to him. It says about those things, your father and mother shall fear and guard my Shabbos. All of you have to guard my honor. So therefore, we see from here that you don't listen to your parents if they tell you to violate the Torah, and it's not specifically about Shabbos. Ella, so rather, what's the reason? Because Mishum de Iko Mifrach. So what's the reason why you say that this is, what's the reason why you say that these laws cannot be used as the source for the idea that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment? Because like we said before, you can't do the mitzvah without these laws. But that can't be, says the Gemara, because Hechsher mitzvah tape claiming us, and we just had that from the earlier source about Shabbos itself. So you can't say that it applies also to the binyan base of Mikdash. That's why we needed about the building of the temple. So we need a new reason. So the Gemara says, you're right. You're right. You're correct. Why do we need the verse to tell us, you shall guard my Shabbos and you shall guard my temple? Why do we need that to tell us that? It can't be to teach us just a regular case of positive commandment overriding a negative commandment by what's called a hechsher mitzvah. So maybe it's to teach us a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment, even in the case of a prohibition of kares. The Gemara says no, it's to teach us something else. What's it coming to teach us? Look at the Tanya. It's teaching us the following principle. I might think a person should worship the temple. There are people who worship temples, like that the temple itself is like a god. It says you should guard my Shabbos and fear my temple. It says guard the Shabbos, and it says have fear of the temple. Just like the guarding of the Shabbos. You're not actually worshiping Shabbos. You're worshiping the one who's commanded us about the Shabbos. So too, the fear that's mentioned by the temple. You're not actually worshiping the temple. You're worshiping the one who commanded us to have a temple. What is, now this is a tangent, what is it? What's the definition of having fear of the temple? It means you're not allowed to go on the Temple Mount, and this is halacha to this day. You can't, when you go on the Temple Mount, you can't go b'maklo, b'minalo, b'punda. So you're not allowed to go in with your walking stick, with the shoes on, with your money belt on, with the dust on your feet. You're not allowed to go, and also, you can't make the Temple Mount a shortcut. You can't say, oh, okay, I want to go from the old city to Mount Olives. I'll just cut across the top of the Temple Mount. There's a path there. You can just, no, you're not allowed to do that. So, and also, I guess the shoes, people, when they go on the Temple Mount today, they don't wear shoes. But I never seen anybody say you're not allowed to take money. But from this it says you're not allowed to take a money belt. So you're not allowed to go with your money belt. I don't know how that's applied. Also, Rakika Mikal V'chomer, you're not allowed to spit on the Temple Mount from a Kal V'chomer, from a logical argument, because this actually relates to the book of Esther, Rashi says, because it says in chapter 4 of the book of Esther, verse 2, it says about Mordechai ki ein lavo al shar melech b'levush sak, that Mordechai, it says that Mordechai was wearing a sackcloth, and you're not allowed to come into the gate of the king in a sackcloth, meaning to say, because it's, and the sackcloth is not disgusting, it's just not respectful. And Rashi says, if you can't go with a sackcloth that's not disgusting, how much more so you cannot spit on the Temple Mount. And if you can't go into a king of flesh and blood with a sackcloth, how much more so can you not spit on the Temple Mount because it's disrespectful to God, and with the dirt on your feet. So you have to wash your feet. So the Eliyahu is mancha beis hamikdash kayim. I only know that you can't go on the Temple Mount when the temple is standing. I only know that that's not going to be allowed. How do I know also that even when the temple is not standing, and you know how to go on the Temple Mount in this manner? Bizman shein beis hamikdash kayim minayin. How do I know even when the temple is not standing? It says, you shall guard my Shabbos, and you shall fear my temple. I'm just like by Shabbos, you guard it forever. I'm meaning to say the commandment of Shabbos is eternal. It's not just while the temple is standing. So too, so too, the fear that you require for the temple is eternal. So anyway, we see from here that this verse, aside from all the halachos that we're learning tangentially about the Temple Mount, that the laws of the holiness of the Temple Mount or the way you behave are even when the temple is not standing. Nevertheless, we've seen from here the important point that this cannot be the source for the idea that, generally speaking, a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment, even when it's a prohibition of kares. So we're still looking for that source, because we want to know why we need the word aleha in this case to tell us that you're not allowed to do yibum with your wife's sister. Now, so the Gemara says, okay, we need it because otherwise you would have thought that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment when it's a prohibition of kares. You would have thought to learn it out, teisi me'avara. You would have learned it out from the prohibition of making a fire on Shabbos, because we saw recently in Parashas Vayakel, it says, Lo sevaru eish b'chol moshvosechem. You're not allowed to kindle a fire in all your dwelling places. And remember there, Rashi there cites our Gemara. So we just had this a few weeks ago, and we'll now see the source for Rashi, because it says in the Academy of Rabbi Yishmael, it says in the Academy of Rabbi Yishmael, it says as follows. And so again, the Gemara wants to use this as a source for the idea that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment, even when the negative commandment is so severe that you get kares. So why does it say you're not allowed to make a fire in all your dwelling places on Shabbos? So the Gemara says, what do you mean, why does it say it? This is based upon the Gemara in Sanhedrin, that there's two approaches to this verse, that you're not allowed to make a fire on Shabbos. Why does it specify it? According to Rabbi Yossi, it's to tell us that if you make a fire, it's a regular prohibition, but not as severe as all the other prohibitions of Shabbos. All the other ones, it's kares, but fire is just a regular prohibition. And Rabbi Nasan is saying it's to tell us, you might have thought, Rashi in different places in Shas interprets it differently, but here he says that you shouldn't say you're not liable for the penalties of Shabbos unless you violate all 39 prohibitions. So therefore, it's to teach us that no, even if you violate one of the 39, you're in violation. So that's what Rabbi Nassan says. But Amar Rava, and then Rava says, Tana Moshavos Kakashua. So Rava says, this Tana Be'er Shmuel, when he says, Ma Tamalomar, why does it say, Lo Sevaru Eish B'chol Moshvosei? If you're not allowed to kindle a fire in all your dwelling places. What he was bothered by was the word Moshavos. That was what bothered him. Meaning to say, Moshavos, Ma Tamalomar. Why does it say the word you should not make a fireplace in all your dwelling places, in your dwelling? Why would it have to specify in all your dwelling places? Since Shabbos is what's called a chovas aguf, Shabbos is an obligation on a person. A person has to keep the Shabbos, not a city. And if that's the case, anything that you're obligated to do with your body, you're obligated to do that both in Israel and outside the land of Israel. So Moshe Vos the Kasav Rahmana b'Shabbos Lomli. So why does the Torah say don't make a fire in all your dwelling places? It should just say don't make it a fire. Why does it need to emphasize in all your dwelling places? So Mishum Rabbi Yishmael Amar Talmud Echad. So name of Rabbi Yishmael, there was one student, and he answered it. Afisha Nemar, because it states in the verse. Excuse me. It states about a person who Rahmanu Litzlan has violated a severe penalty from heaven. He violates Jewish law and he's supposed to be executed as a result of this, executed by the court below. It says about such a person, if a person will commit a sin, commit a crime, and he'll be sentenced to death, and he shall be put to death. So there's a verse in Deuteronomy that states that. I might think that the court should put him to death, whether it's during the week or even on Shabbos. Umani mekayem mechalela mos yumas. And how do I fulfill the verse that says you shall guard the Shabbos and one who desecrates it will be put to death? B'shar malachos. That means you can't violate all the other prohibitions of Shabbos. Chutz misas bezin. But the court can actually put you to death on Shabbos, even though it's a violation of we'll see, the Gemara is going to discuss which exact violation it is when you put somebody to death on Shabbos. But I might have thought that the court could execute you on Shabbos. O eno ella afil misas bezdin. Or maybe it includes that the court cannot do it. Umani mekayim v'humas. And what does it mean when it says v'humas? They should put to death b'chol v'lo b'Shabbos, not on Shabbos. Oh, eino ela afilu b'Shabbos. Or maybe you put him to death even on Shabbos. The court has the right to do it. So therefore, the verse states lo sevaro eish b'chol moshvosechem. Therefore, the verse states should not kindle a fire in all your dwelling places. Meaning to say, even the courts do not put him to death. Hold on. So, and ulalan huomer, and later on, by the place of where the courts are sitting, it says vayu eila lachem l'chukas mishpat l'torosechem b'chol moshvosechem. It says about your courts that this shall be your laws for all your generations. And just like the dwelling places that are listed later on are basically referring to the word Moshavos refers to the court. Av Moshavos Murim Khan. So the word Moshavos here refers to the Bezdin. Amar Rahmana Lo Sevaru. And the Torah says that you're not allowed to kindle a fire, meaning to say that a court is not allowed to put somebody to death on Shabbos. And so now we've seen this brisa. The brisa says, that you're not allowed to make a fire in all your dwelling places on Shabbos. And the Gemara said there's two ways to interpret you should not allowed to make a fire. Rabbi Yossi says a regular prohibition. Rabbi Nassim says no, it means to tell us that this prohibition applies to teach us that even if you violate one of the 39 prohibitions, you're going to get the death penalty. And about that, the Torah says, why does it say in all your dwelling places? To say that it applies to a court, that a court also cannot execute someone on the Shabbos. So the Gemara says, now going back to this story, to this brisa, my love, isn't this brisa referring to Rabbi Nassan? He isn't referring to Rabbi Nassan, who says, that why does it say you're not allowed to make a fire? It's to say that you're in violation, even if you do one of the 39 prohibitions. The time of the Kasav Rahmana, and what's the reason why you're not allowed to do it? Because the Torah says lo sevaro. Because the Torah says you're not allowed to make a fire. Meaning there's a prohibition. And so what's the reason why that teaches us that you don't override the prohibition here. But we're not for the specific reason of lo sevaro, we would say that the court should execute this person. because we'd say a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment, even in the case of kares. So we would say dachit overrides it. So isn't this the source for our idea that a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment in the case of kares? Gemara says, no, Rabbi Yossi. No, this is Rabbi Yossi. It's not Rabbi Nassim, it's Rabbi Yossi's position. He says we're talking about a general prohibition, not such a severe penalty of kares. And so therefore we're still searching for the idea. The Gemara says, wait a second. Okay, let's say it's even Rabbi Yossi, but they have Nami Rabbi Yossi who says that this is just a general prohibition of fire. But Eimer de Rabbi Yossi, Havara L'Avyat Sayeh, Rabbi Yossi says that fire is just a regular prohibition, but Havara Gredasa. But that's just a regular fire. But Havara de Bezdin, but the fire that the court makes in order to execute the person by burning is Bishul Psilo, that you're cooking the lead. Amar Rabbi Sheishes, Mali Bishul Psilo, Mali Bishul Simanim. What does it matter what you're cooking if you're cooking the lead, which is in a block form, or you're cooking spices? There is not the prohibition of fire, there is the prohibition of cooking. And so therefore, that is going to be a kares penalty. So maybe this is the source from the idea that generally speaking, a positive commandment would override a negative commandment, even by a prohibition of kares. So Amar Rav Shimi Barashi, Haitana lo mishum da asi aseh v'docha aseh. So he says, no, the source of our Tana over here, this Tana Be'er Shmuel, the reason why he needs Moshe Vosechem is not because otherwise we would have said a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. And so therefore we need this word Moshe Vosechem. That's not the reason here. It's not because of the Asi Aseh V'Dochi Los Aseh. That's not the reason. What's the reason? Mishum Demaisi Mikav Chomer, because otherwise we would have said that the court should execute the person because we could have made a logical argument. What would we have said? Mani Mekayim Mechalel Amos Yumas B'Shar Melachos. I might have said, how do you fulfill this idea that one who desecrates the Shabbos is going to be put to death? That's by other activities aside from somebody who is aside from a court that executes. But when a court wants to act and fulfill its job as a court, I would say that it does override the Shabbos, and it's from the Kal V'Chomer. What's the Kal V'Chomer? On the top of 7a, the Kal V'Chomer, the logical argument is follows. Uma avoda shi chamura v'docha Shabbos, just like service in the temple is a very severe penalty because it overrides the Shabbos, and nevertheless, ritzicha docha osa. If somebody murdered somebody and he was a Kohen, Rahman al-Atzlan, and the Kohen runs and he says, I need a worship in the temple, you say, no, your worship does not override the fact that you need to be brought to judgment. And so therefore, service in the temple overrides Shabbos. Because we do services on Shabbos, we do slaughter and other violations on fire, on Shabbos in the temple. And yet, the service is over. The avoda is overridden by the fact that we sometimes take a Kohen from in the middle of his service to bring him to execute him. So avoda is strict, which pushes off Shabbos, but to punish a murderer, that overrides even the service in the temple. As it states me, from a person who is next to my altar, you shall take him to be put to death. So Shabbos and Nitches Mimnei Avoda, so Shabbos, which is pushed away because of service in the temple, for sure this should be overridden by the need to execute a murderer. So that's why that's the source for this idea. The source for this idea is not a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. So it can't be a source for the. So we do need the word allow, but the source for this idea is. So we can't say that we need the word allow from this source. The source of the idea is the Kal V'Chomer argument. So Gemara says, "Umay o eno de ka'amar," and why did our Mishnah say, why did the Brayso say, "Oh eno"? Maybe even the death by the court is prohibited on Shabbos. That it states it, because from this language it's clear that even from the Kal V'Chomer we might have thought that a bezin does not override Shabbos. But why would we think that? So why would we think that? But you know what? We're going to stop here. God willing, we'll pick this up tonight at 7:20 and also tomorrow morning at 6:30 and 8. But I want to say before we stop, First of all, thank you to our sponsors, and Learning Gray sponsored the whole month of March in memory of her brother Bobby, her mother Beverly, her grandmother Grace, but also today is the Shloshim, tonight and tomorrow, of my dear friend Donald Lubick, and Jonathan, his son, who's our Chaver, has sponsored today's learning in memory of Daniel ben Yisrael Zichrono Livracha in the Shema, where we talked a lot today about honoring your father and mother, even if they tell you to override a mitzvah. But Donald would never have told his son to override a mitzvah, God forbid. He always encourage his son's learning and everything about his Torah observance. So it should be a blessing, and everybody should have a good day. Anybody have any questions? Yes, no questions. George, you have a question?
Yeah, for me, if I may, are you still recording?
No, let me stop it. Hold on.